Welcome to Drucker on the Dial, a show on management and leadership where timely issues meet timeless principles. Produced by the Drucker Institute at Claremont Graduate University. I'm your host, Phalana Tiller. Today on Drucker on the Dial, we're going to hear from two thought-provoking guests. First, we'll chat with Geoffrey Brewer of the Gallup Press, the publishing arm of America's most well-known public opinion polling company, about his new book, Decade of Change, Managing in Times of Uncertainty. And then we'll hear from the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Richard Ford, who has just edited a new literary anthology on the way that our jobs help define us. Although Brewer and Ford are coming from very different places, you'll hear some interesting echoes around the theme of the centrality of work in our lives. Our first guest today is Geoffrey Brewer. Geoffrey Brewer is the editorial director of Gallup Press, which publishes books and the Gallup Management Journal. He's the editor of numerous bestsellers, including How Full Is Your Bucket?, which topped the New York Times list, and the #1 Wall Street Journal bestseller, StrengthsFinder 2.0. Jeff recently co-edited Decade of Change, Managing in Times of Uncertainty, with his Gallup colleague, Barb Sanford. The book compiles essays and interviews from such diverse contributors as the Internet's co-creator and the CEO of Campbell's Soup. For his part, Peter Drucker spent a lot of time thinking about managing in times of uncertainty. In 1980, Drucker published Managing in Turbulent Times, and in 1995, he turned out the title Managing in a Time of Great Change. Peter Drucker wrote, "The one certainty about times ahead, the times in which managers will have to work and perform, is that they will be turbulent times. And in turbulent times, the first task of management is to make sure of the institution's capacity for survival, to make sure of its structural strength and soundness, and its capacity to survive a blow, to adapt to sudden change, and to avail itself of new opportunities." Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Jeff, I've been thinking about your book and thinking about how it relates to the book that Peter Drucker wrote, Managing in Turbulent Times, and trying to think just on the surface, just kind of in a bigger picture sense, why this book now? Why did you all decide to kind of bring these essays together and compile them in this one book and talk about this particular decade and what's gone on? I mean, what's happened since Drucker's book? Are times even more turbulent?
Well, I think that we just looked at the past 10 years going back to 2001 and stopped and evaluated and thought, what breathtaking change has taken place these past 10 years. It's hard to quantify and say, was there more change than in previous decades? But certainly the 2000s were preceded by a decade of relative peace and prosperity and kind of a breather in sort of turbulent world events. And it just seemed in this past decade, kind of Murphy's Law came into effect. You know, whatever could go wrong did. Mm-hmm. We had 9/11. We've had, well, America's been involved in 2 wars, but there have been conflicts elsewhere. We had of course, the great collapse of the global financial market and the ripple effects that stemmed from 2008. Natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. Right. It just seemed relentless. And what we thought was, since my co-editor Bob Sanford and I edit the Gallup Management Journal, we thought how interesting it was that the Gallup Management Journal was launched in March of 2001, right at the sort of beginning of what was going to be a period of really, really intense change that really started, of course, with the tragedy of the terrorist attack on 9/11. Mm-hmm. But that was only the beginning somehow. And I think that essentially we thought, from a business management perspective, I mean, we can talk about these changes sociologically and politically and electorally and all those things, but my God, what an amazing impact this has on managers mm-hmm. and executives, mm-hmm. on people who are concerned about employee morale, concerned about customers who may lose customers, may have lost customers as a result of the collapse of '08. So we just we realized that our existence as a publication had been parallel with some of the most remarkable events in recent history. And we realized also that as we were looking through our archives that we'd written a lot about them.
I'm really interested in the range of topics. I mean, you have such different and disparate writers and contributors to the book. You have folks who are talking about the internet, or people who are talking about healthcare or demographics, and the future of Campbell's soup. What would you say is the thread that holds all this together? What are some of the broad brushes that hold these selected pieces together?
Sure. Looking at a changing world, a world that's changing a lot faster than we thought it would, a world that is changing in ways that we hadn't anticipated and that we may feel anxious about. And kind of the purpose of the book, we were very, very adamant on this one point, Barb and I were, that this not just be seen and read and viewed as a retrospective. We really thought, it's not like everything, everything's hunky-dory right now and we're in it's smooth sailing. We thought that a lot of the insights that could be gleaned from the past 10 years on a variety of topics could be applied in the future. So we really realized that we had quite an anthology of thought on a lot of different areas by either Nobel Prize winning academics or CEOs who could give us insights on how to move forward in uncertain times. So we like to see it as a look back, but really as a look back that can be applied moving forward.
There's a chapter in here titled Global Migration Patterns and Job Creation, and it's a discussion of the changing demographics and how people are moving and how jobs are moving. There's some points where Drucker himself talked about how we collectively often fail to pay attention to demographics. You just mentioned that there's, in this archive of work that you all could look back on, this retrospective content, you could also glean some lessons for the future. What do you think about this idea that oftentimes we sort of don't look at the obvious, or we don't look at the demographics or the information that might be right in front of us?
Well, that is a problem, and then we look back and say, how did we miss it? I think that, one thing that's sort of wonderful about working for a company like Gallup, which is known, of course, for its public opinion polling, but we also do polling of employees and customers and managers and the like. So we do a lot of business and organizational type research. You sort of have it in your face all the time, what's going on in the world and how things are changing. And by its nature, polling and research, you don't only look at a number. If you look at, take a more sort of the more simple ones, it would be look at, okay, what is Obama's approval rating today? Well, it's I believe it's like 47% today. But that 47% is not interesting in isolation. Mm-hmm. So one immediately says, well, what was it last week? What was it a month ago? What was his high? What was his highest in his presidency? What was the lowest in his presidency? And so when you're exposed to a lot of polling data, you're also pushed to constantly look for patterns and trends. So I feel sort of very fortunate to be with an organization and to be in an environment that's always thinking about these things, and I guess maybe not missing the obvious. Mm-hmm. But even so, when we launched our world poll in 2005, we found some things that were, if not obvious, startling to us to some degree. Oh, wow. And one of them is, I'm referencing the article that you refer to, Global Migration Patterns and Job Creation, which happened to have been written in this instance by our CEO, Jim Clifton. Mm-hmm. And what he built the article around was that what he calls one of the single biggest discoveries Gallup has ever made, mm-hmm. and that is what the whole world wants is a good job. And now you can think, well, of course it is, but when you look at the past, I mean, people have identified with religion, or people have identified with tribe or group or various and sundry other things. And what we've discovered in our research, moving to the forefront, it's actually going to be a subject of a completely independent book of this that Jim Clifton is writing called The Coming Jobs War. It's such a hot topic that if leaders and if political leaders and business leaders and city leaders can figure out how to generate good jobs for as many people as possible in the world, that would be the source of a lot more stability than anything else.
Right.
And that's something that we think, wow, okay, that makes sense, but it's something we still had to discover. It wasn't just, it wasn't necessarily apparent to us until we really did the research, until we started finding patterns from polling people in 140 or 150 countries, and you start to see those patterns emerge, the importance of a good job and how important it is to build an economy around the generation of good jobs.
Right, people being able to be productive and be contributors in their own lives and in their communities.
Well, I mean, not to put, too fine a point on it, but what was the signal event that started the, Arab Spring and the Arab Revolution was one very, very frustrated vendor in Tunisia who set himself on fire. Now that wasn't, his frustration, again, I don't have the stories right in front of me, but my understanding of it is he had some frustration with the local authorities and the ability I think he was being shut down or couldn't do his job or something like that. It was a really basic human thing that he wanted to be able to perform this function and be this vendor and do this kind of work, and I believe he was impaired from doing it or impeded from doing it. And as a result, he took a rather drastic action that really changed the course of history in the Middle East.
Right.
So it says that now, would that not have happened? Would all this haven't happened? Well, it probably would have been triggered by something else. But it's very interesting if you look at some of the frustrations in places like Egypt and elsewhere. You'll find it won't be very long before you find an economic and a jobs component to it, particularly amongst young people who are educated and sort of ambitious and eager to do something and not finding a productive outlet. That
takes me to another of the essays that I thought was really interesting, or actually it's an interview with economist Angus Deaton, where he's discussing this idea that money can impact your sense of happiness and that workers need to be compensated at a level, there's almost a certain universal figure that they discovered, at which point people reach a kind of equilibrium of happiness in their work. It sort of sent me back to where Drucker himself talked about the idea that keeping workers happy goes beyond paychecks and that they need to be happy, physiologically, psychologically, socially, but that you cannot ignore the power of money and economics and happiness. Do you have any comment about that idea of money is just as important as other intrinsic rewards in work?
You're really talking about the fundamental question, does money buy happiness? And I think the answer is kind of complicated. It can buy happiness, but other things have to be at play as well. If you want to take, for instance, Gallup's research, which underpins, a good deal of the work in this book. With Gallup, we look at employee engagement. We look at how engaged people are in their jobs. We actually have a 12-item survey which measures engagement. Things like, I know what's expected of me at work. You rank that on a scale. Or I have the materials and equipment I need to do my job well. I have a supervisor at work cares about my development, that sort of thing. None of the 12 items that measure engagement even mention the word money or compensation. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, but a whole lot of other things come into place. I think the understanding is that a certain level of income is necessary to have a certain amount of happiness and contentment so that you're not living in grinding poverty or day to day and that kind of thing. But it doesn't, once you reach a certain level, and I think it's not as high as we always think it would be. Once you reach a certain level of income and stability, other things start to matter too. Whether your aspirations are fulfilled, whether you're engaged at work. Going back to the previous question, whether you have a good job. And in this interview that we did with Angus Deaton, he explored whether life satisfaction or happiness measures are important or meaningful, and whether the pursuit of happiness or wealth matters more to societies than the development of human potential. So there's other things at play, and I think we know this stuff intuitively. I think if you would ask any single working person questions about their well-being, their satisfaction of their life, money's going to come in play. You will hear from some people, I make all the money in the world and I'm miserable because I'm not really doing what I love. I'm good at what I do, but it's not my passion. You'll hear people say, I make pretty good money, but the trade-off for me is I I try to adjust the knobs and the scales and say, I want to make a certain amount of money, but I want a certain amount of happiness, and I want a certain amount of fulfillment at work. And that comes into, do I have a good boss? Do I work for a good company? A lot of it really, as Gallup has discovered, comes down to your immediate frontline boss.
Yeah.
We have a saying that people join companies but leave managers. And
right.
I think we've all know that to be true.
Mm-hmm.
So people will say, you know what, maybe I could make a few tens of thousands or whatever more dollars with more bonuses at a certain company, but I like what I'm making here in relation. I like the whole package here. I feel I'm paid competitively, but I know I could make more money, but the trade-off is I might have a little more freedom, a little more time. Nobody's breathing down my neck in terms of micromanaging, a micromanaging supervisor. So does money buy happiness? There's a certain level where it absolutely buys you kind of a ticket into the door of being happy. But beyond that point, there is a certain threshold, and I've heard different figures on this. The point being that there's a certain basic level of income that you need to just have your needs met.
Right.
That money isn't a continuous source of stress. And it's interesting because we don't really get into it in this book because this digs back through the past 10 years and our work in this area of well-being. When I say our, I mean Gallup. Our work in the area of well-being is much more recent. And Gallup has found 5 dimensions of well-being: career, financial, community, social, and physical. What we've discovered is that well-being happens in the way that those things interact with each other. So, if you're really stressed about money and kind of angry or bummed out or always anxious about it, that might sap your social life. It might sap your physical life. Or if you don't exercise enough, you might not have the energy to be maybe as successful or focused as you could be.
Right.
Maybe you're a little sluggish. If you're disengaged from your community at large, that might affect your outlook. Whereas if you're if you're very engaged in your community at large, you feel good. You have this feeling of abundance that could spill over into other things, make you a more effective person. That might translate into more financial success as well. So all these things kind of interact. You have to be very careful about how you define happiness, and I think that's part of the problem.
Right.
And I think well-being is sort of emerging maybe as an alternative definition because it seems to be more complete and holistic as opposed to something maybe a bit more elusive.
So I'm interested in this other essay in here by Brian Ott and Emily Killam, a little bit to your point about how this book not just reflects on the past, but kind of gives us an opportunity to think about tools for the future. And they wrote an essay called "Would You Fire Your Boss?" Also kind of just reflecting on the little quote you offered earlier about how people join companies but they leave managers. What about this idea of workers or employees kind of having a little bit more responsibility or ownership for guiding their managers or guiding their bosses in terms of getting that person to supervise them and bring out the best in them, as a worker? What do you think about that, turning that thing on its head a little bit?
What I understand to be true, and from our research and work, is you can, as an employee, have a certain positive impact on your manager, and you can, in some situations, perhaps be able to cajole or push your manager to understand how you like to be managed. I don't know how far you're really going to get with that. I think that there are managers who are open to it and there are managers who aren't.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine that if you come into a certain manager's office and sort of say, you're not quite managing me the way that works for me. Perhaps you can do this or that or the other thing. I think that could actually work with some managers, but I would say that manager already is a great manager because they're open to it. I think that there's a dynamic between employees and managers that it would be very hard to have that conversation with somebody who is not a particularly good manager to begin with, because they're probably one of the reasons they wouldn't be very good managers. They're not receptive to a conversation like that. So I think that only goes as far as it can go, and I think that a big variable in that would be how receptive one's manager is to it. Now, but I think another way to look at it in terms of the employee's self-responsibility and agency is getting smarter about knowing something about the person you're going to be working for before you work for that person, if at all possible. And there are actually many opportunities, and people do that all the time. I mean, I think, savvy people, when they are looking for a new job, either outside of their company or within a company, they know. That's probably the more fruitful way to go about it. I would not discourage somebody from having that conversation, but I think you really have to know. However, evaluating up front, really putting significant thought up front and gathering as much information as possible about a prospective manager, I think that would be critical, because that manager could make or break your experience at a company or an organization.
And your progression beyond that, probably.
Absolutely. So that becomes critical. I mean, I think realizing this, sort of keeping that mantra in mind, people join companies but they leave managers. That's a very, very important thing, I think, to know when you're evaluating work situations. You can say, wow, such and such company, what a great place to work, and there's artistic or creative or financial freedom or whatever, and they have great bonuses and on and on and on. But the person I'm going to happen to work for at that company is a dreadful manager. That's going to poison the entire experience.
Right.
And I think it's important to be mindful of that. And I think that you talk about changes over the past 10 years that we've discussed in Decade of Change. I think that there's more of a growing awareness of those things. I mean, all the work that we've done in Gallup related to our 12-item employee survey, the Q12, there's been, over the past 10 years, I mean, there's just tens of thousands of, maybe millions of people have taken it, and so we've learned more and more about what good management is, and certainly management has undergone a big change over the past 10 years, not necessarily even from these big cataclysmic world events, but just an evolution that was already in process prior to the decade.
So just as a final question, and then I'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us and being so generous with your time today. But just, do you think that the practice of management and just the discipline of management and the content in a book like yours is content that's useful for an audience beyond someone who sees themselves as a manager? Would you give this book to anyone and everyone and tell them that you imagine that there might be a nugget in there for them, or what do you think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Decade of Change there's a lot of potential readers for it. I mean, a lot of the information in the book is useful for managers, but not uniquely. I mean, I think anybody who's an employee of an organization is going to learn from this, because it does deal with questions of employee engagement. It deals with questions of how people survive and maintain engagement during periods of layoffs, which has obviously been, a big issue. Post September 2008. Right. I would say there's also just a lot of stuff in here for people who like to think about things. I mean, we have a couple of really great interviews just right off the bat. One with the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist who won the, I believe, 2002 Nobel Prize for economics. And that's interesting. And what he's talking about is looking at the role of emotion, bias, and context in how we make economic decisions. The point being, he's challenging, maybe even upending to some degree, the traditional rational agent model, the supply and demand, and really the role of the irrational in decision making. And I think that's a fascinating change. I would think that a lot of what this book is really just getting a lot of interesting people together in the pages of a book, and understanding what they've thought over the past 10 years and trying to understand how to apply it into the future. It's like being in the company of really interesting, intelligent people, including an executive who's way out in front on climate change and greening his company, while most people are just sort of messing around with the concept of greening their company and maybe doing some marketing related to it. He's really doing it and doing it profitably. It's kind of being around some really interesting, thoughtful, cool, smart people.
We should have a dinner party, Jeff. We should have all these folks around the table at the same time.
It would be quite a party, that's for sure. It wouldn't be dull.
Have a Decade of Change dinner party, hosted by Drucker on the Dial.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you so much for being with us on the show today, Jeff. It was really interesting talking with you. I so appreciate your time, and congratulations with the book, and good luck. We'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And now, Rick Wartzman, the Drucker Institute's executive director, with his biweekly column, The Drucker Difference.
If ever an entire sector of the U.S. economy was guilty of committing one of Peter Drucker's greatest sins of mismanagement, confusing activity with results, it's healthcare. As the Commonwealth Fund noted in a report last year, spending per hospital visit in the U.S. exceeds that of all other countries belonging to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and American patients count among the most likely to receive procedures requiring advanced technology. Yet at the same time, the U.S. now ranks in the bottom quartile in life expectancy among OECD countries and has seen the smallest gains in this metric over the past 2 decades. In May, WellPoint announced that it's taking steps to counter these trends. In what experts have described as the most extensive effort of its kind, the giant insurer said it was revamping the way it reimburses about 1,500 hospitals across the nation, so that annual payment increases are pegged to WellPoint's definition of quality care rather than to the quantity of services delivered. WellPoint's new formula, based 55% on health outcomes, 35% on patient safety measures, and 10% on patient satisfaction, is one piece of a broader push to tie healthcare compensation to effectiveness, not simply to volume. For its part, the Obama administration is reworking how the government pays hospitals through Medicare so that the system becomes more results-oriented as well. On one level, these moves are designed to curb costs, and WellPoint, which policymakers and the media have slammed in recent years for denying coverage to people with illnesses and pre-existing conditions, is certainly a company with its eye on the bottom line. But if WellPoint's new reimbursement policy works, it should also prod doctors, nurses, and other medical personnel to make significant strides toward giving their customers, the sick, what they value most, a chance to return to health and stay well. In this broader sense, the company's actions can instruct all sorts of organizations, hoping to measure and improve their performance. Drucker pointed out that public service institutions, including many hospitals, tend to have a particularly tough time in this area. Because of their inherent complexity, such enterprises are prone to the deadly disease of bureaucracy, that is, toward mistaking rules, regulations, and the smooth functioning of the machinery for accomplishment, Drucker wrote in Toward the Next Economics. To combat this, Drucker advised, the organization must set explicit goals. To say our objective is healthcare is operationally a meaningless statement, Drucker asserted. Instead, this grand sense of purpose must be converted into specific work assignments that in turn can be analyzed and appraised. Indeed, this process is what good management is all about, deliberately translating a lofty mission into a concrete series of tasks and feedback mechanisms that lead to smarter decisions. Drucker recalled, for example, that Sears Roebuck defined its mission in the 1920s as being the buyer for the American family, a totally intangible statement, he said. But the ways in which Sears then set to accomplish this mission, that is, to develop a range of appliances that most nearly satisfy the largest number of homeowners at the most economical price, Drucker added, was an operational objective from which clear and measurable goals with respect to product line, service, assortment, price, and market penetration could be derived. Similarly, saving souls as a mission of a church is totally intangible, Drucker wrote. At least the bookkeeping is not of this world. But a church could easily define and assess the objective of doubling the number of people under the age of 35 who attend Sunday services. Setting these sorts of measurable objectives is exactly what WellPoint seems to be driving at. The company has actually been piloting a pay-for-performance model for some time, a start-small approach that Drucker also would have liked, and it says that the initiative has already prompted behavior change. For instance, by measuring how fast someone's blood vessel is opened during a cardiac event, and then compensating hospitals in Virginia accordingly, the company has witnessed a reduction in variation across different facilities, as well as a more rapid response time, meaning that patients are receiving the proper care more quickly. Other hospitals have been graded on whether they prohibit smoking on their campuses, or whether they've generated discharge plans detailing how patients should take their medication. Not everyone is pleased with the new arrangement. Critics maintain that hospitals in poor neighborhoods could face penalties because their discharged patients often get sick again for a host of reasons that have nothing to do with the quality of care. But goals and measurements are not immutable. They should be monitored and adjusted continually. Meantime, with at least some guideposts in place, the administrator can move from diagnosis to prognosis, Drucker wrote. He can now lay down what he expects will happen and take proper action to see whether it actually does happen. Armed with this evidence, he can then act as a manager should, systematically reviewing objectives, roles, priorities, and allocation of resources, as Drucker put it. At many hospitals, that would amount to a procedure that no one could object to, a much-needed transplant surgery with results replacing activity and quality replacing quantity.
A version of that essay first appeared in The Drucker Difference, a bi-weekly column for Bloomberg Businessweek.com. Our next guest today is author Richard Ford. Richard Ford is perhaps best known for his novels Independence Day, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1996, The Sports Writer, and The Lay of the Land. Ford recently edited the new literary anthology, Blue Collar, White Collar, No Collar, Stories of Work, which explores the multifaceted role that work plays in our lives. The book includes stories by an amazing cast of authors, including Eudora Welty, Jeffrey Eugenides, Junot Diaz, Alice Munro, and Joyce Carol Oates. All author proceeds from the anthology go to fund 826 Michigan, a youth literacy program in a state that has seen more than its fair share of misery from unemployment. Some of you may be wondering why we've invited a novelist like Ford to appear on a show about management and leadership. But Peter Drucker believes strongly that management is a liberal art. Because the discipline of management ultimately boils down to human beings and how we interact, it's best practice when infused with lessons from the humanities, history, theology, philosophy, sociology, and yes, literature. I'm rereading each summer, and have for many years, The Main Novelists, Drucker wrote to a friend in 1997. Among them, he said, were Austen, Thackeray, Trollope, and George Eliot. I never read management books, Drucker added. All they do is corrupt the style. Welcome to Drucker on the Dial, Richard.
I first want to talk to you a little bit about the selections in here and where some of the decisions come from. What were some of the common themes, and if you just have any stories you want to share with us about how you came to choose what you chose to include in this anthology.
Well, having done anthologies in my life before, I wanted to portray the subject, as it were, as broadly as I could, and in ways that were apt to be surprising to the reader. Mm-hmm. The way in which work, although in many lives it is focal, might in fact be almost tangential mm-hmm. to to what goes on, and yet its tangentialness is because it's in the story somehow important and significant and load bearing. Mm-hmm. So I wanted there to be a great diversity of the way in which work figured into these stories. Some guy who wrote about it in the New York Times complained that it wasn't enough about either guys in boardrooms wearing suits or what it was like to dig a ditch. Well, in my view, and there is something about it. There's a Jeff Eugenides story, which is a more standard sort of corporate workplace story. Mm-hmm. But in my view, fiction has to do something which life itself doesn't do. I mean, if you can go to life and find just exactly what a fiction gives you, then you don't need the fiction. You don't need the story. The story has to be in that way unique. So I was trying to find, as I said, ways in which work crept into our lives as a background, as a medium for how we think, as an excuse for our faults and our foibles, as a rationale for our happinesses and our tragedies. And so that's what I was trying to do.
In your story, Under the Radar, work is tangential there, right? One might say that it's tangential, I guess, but it's not necessarily entirely tangential.
No, I mean, I think in that little story, work surrounds everything that takes place because of what the story and me as its author can say. I focused on what I made the reader notice and what I made the reader not notice, what I left out, what I included. The one thing the story doesn't try to do, and this, I guess, would be my goal in the whole anthology, I wasn't trying to say that work is
the cause of the events that take place in my story, which is to say that either that a woman betrays her husband, or that the husband brutalizes his wife, or that she perhaps even runs over him in a car. And yet it's there. It takes place. It has a salience in the whole environment that they deal with, as well as in the vocabulary that they speak to each other, that they use to speak to each other. So it's that kind of indirection that I was keen to bring into the anthology. I mean, if I could just say, work is horrible, and you get calluses on your soul and on your hands, and therefore it makes you, glum and dull and brutal. Well, actually, we don't need stories to tell us that.
There's a quote from Peter Drucker, who wrote in 1973. It's his classic entitled "Management: Tasks, Responsibilities, and Practices," and he says in this book.
My wife read that.
Ah, okay. So you're somewhat familiar with this title.
Yeah.
He says that work is impersonal and objective, but working is done by a human being, and as the whole human relations tag has it, one cannot hire a hand. The whole man always comes with it. I wonder if you have any thoughts about this whole idea about we all as workers kind of are complex, dynamic beings, and we're not just a cog in the wheel, and we go do this thing that maybe is impersonal and objective, but it really can't ever be.
No, it can't be. I mean, I will use as my whipping boy this guy who wrote about it in the New York Times, who seemed to aver that the business of business is business, and if you're going to do an anthology that's about work and some of it's about business, then you actually have to have, people doing business, whatever the hell that is. I think if the public businessmen knew what it was, they would be better at it. In truth, the business of business is life. Mm-hmm. And I think that takes in what Mr. Drucker wrote about, you have to hire the whole man when you get somebody to do a job. And when you hire the whole man, you get his wife, you get his fears, you get his kids, you get his past, you get his aspirations for a future. And all of those things figure into the execution of whatever his duties are.
Hey, I read somewhere recently that Drucker actually intentionally and very proudly never read management books. He wasn't interested in them. He only read fiction. His reasoning behind this was that he saw management as a discipline or a structure that's applicable to any and all fields of life.
I understand. It's kind of like why novelists shouldn't read criticism.
Right.
It's just always somebody telling you how to do what you're supposed to do, but that you better know better than they know. It's always after the fact.
Right. I'm interested in one little slice back to your story. You talk about money and this parallel this kind of emblem that money stands for. The money, losing it, gaining it, spending it, hoarding it. That was only an emblem, though a good one, for what was happening here right now, meaning sort of between Marjorie and Stephen in your story. What about money? What about the need for money as workers and in life?
Well, I don't really think that I have a very enlightened view about that. I mean, it's curious that I don't. I know lots of people who were my age and who had parents who were Depression-era parents, like my parents were, who are very both keen about money and very keen about either losing it or having a lot of it, and who care about it a lot. I never cared about it. Mm-hmm. I just somehow or another, having money or a lot of it or not having much of it was never really an issue for me. So in creating a sort of a formula in which work eventuates in some kind of consequence, money seems to me to be one of the lesser and one of the less interesting consequences that work eventuates in. I mean, I think that it eventuates in all of those things that I described my father having experienced, a sense of being a producer, a sense of having his destiny in his hands, a sense of having good character, a sense of being a predictable human being in a way that character requires, mm-hmm. and that money somehow, earning a living, is kind of the low end of the moral totem pole for me. Now that of course it just is reliant on my general attitude toward money, and somebody else would put it differently. I mean, like they say, if you say it ain't the money, it's the money.
Right. Right.
Well, maybe that's true of me if I say it's not the money, that I'm so obsessed by money I can't even bear to speak its name.
Right.
I don't think so, but how would I know? It's only me.
And I mean, somebody might also say that one can only really hold that position if one is privileged enough to feel secure and safe. You know, you might have to be concerned about money if you came from a place where there was an absence of it. You know, there's sort of that argument as well. I don't know.
Well, I don't think that that's true, actually. Because I know I ran out of money 2 or 3 years ago, and I ran out of money as I was someplace quail hunting down in Tennessee, and happened to notice that my wife called me up and she said, "Oh, by the way," she said, "don't use that credit card anymore." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Don't use that credit card?" She said, "We don't have any money in the bank."
Wow.
And I thought, okay.
All right.
And I told my pal, I said, we just ran out of money. And his face just turned ashen. He said, "You've run out of money." And I think I was about 63 years old. And I said, "Well, that happened." But so I don't think it's necessarily true that you have to have it to not worry about it very much. I mean, that may be what rich people think. That might be the great fear that rich people are possessed of.
Huh. Interesting.
Right.
And you've talked about this a little bit in some of the previous interviews and reflections that you've shared about this book, and how your definition of what you do for a living doesn't necessarily feel like work to you.
It seems easy.
Right.
And it seems, almost fanciful in its easiness, and it is not destined to make you any money for the most part. The fact that I have made a pretty good living for 40 years doing it one way or another is just a fluke. It's a complete fluke. I mean, I could just as easily have never made a nickel and I'd be teaching at Ball State and teaching 4 classes of composition into my 60s, and that would be the much more predictable path, I think.
Were there ever points in your earlier career where you were kind of a mercenary hired gun writer? Have you ever done that? Or have you always written what you want to write?
Well, I've always thought that I worked for money. I always thought, whatever the famous line is, whoever said it, Evan Wilson, I guess, anybody who doesn't work for money is a moron. I mean, I have always thought that since this is the only thing that I had any hope of doing, that I should at least try to make money doing it. But I could never make very much, except in the odd time when, somebody bought something for the movies or just something, again, flukish came along. But I always did insist that people pay me for my work. I wouldn't do things for nothing, and I still don't do things for nothing. Although it should be said that I do this blue collar, white collar, no collar for not a red penny.
That's right. I noticed that. Yeah, that all of the author, that you're contributing to 826 Michigan, which is a literacy program.
We all are, right? But that's a real, for me, Phalana, that's a real rarity. That I would do something for nothing. I always say to people, if you can't pay me anything, don't worry about it. I love to fall out with people about money. But it's never very much money, I should say.
So why was it important to you to do this for this?
Because of my old man, I think, because of my old man. Because it gave me that illusion that I was doing something that would bring to me the virtues that my father's work brought to him, even if it was virtual in nature. I'm obviously fairly conflicted about whether or not what I do is work, but I've tried to make that conflict at least amusing to people when I write about it.
Sure. When you were sharing a bit about the formation of your definition of work and kind of the impact of your dad's example in your early years, you mentioned this idea about how for a lot of people, work and the presence of work and the kind of work that one does can almost verify the very humanity or existence of somebody, right? Or their moral composition. I wonder if you have any thoughts then about what happens to people, say, in an economy like today where we're hearing about, skyrocketing unemployment. What happens to the psyche? What happens to a person if and when there's the absence of that grounding identity?
Well, I think people become existentially isolated. I mean, that is just, I don't mean to say that it inevitably happens or that it must or should happen, but I think that's certainly one of the great fears that you lose, among other things, your community. And you have to go out and find another kindred community different from the one that was in your workplace. And I think as much as you lose money and as much as you may lose stature in your own environment with your family, losing your community seems to me to be a hugely significant loss. That's always the thing that work provides us. It provides us coworkers. It provides us mates. And so that's, there are lots of people who know a lot more than I would ever know about that. But you can see it on the nightly news whenever you see people interviewed waiting to get their unemployment checks. One of the things that they seem there is atomized.
Yeah.
They don't have anything but their bad luck in common with the person standing in front of them or the person standing behind them. Of course, Chekhov would put people like that into a story, and they would perhaps find something beyond their poverty that they could rely on.
Yeah.
But that's asking a lot in a country like America, which puts so much emphasis on money.
And so, did you have to kind of evolve the system? Did you have to evolve that little idea of, I've got to throw my capital to the wall, I've got to entangle myself with the publishers in order to get anything done? Is that a system that you had to create for yourself to kind of manage the organization, of Richard Ford?
Well, I think over the course of any writer's life, she or he will do things for reasons that get subsumed in later sets of reasons. When you're young, you do things because, say you write a novel because you don't know if you can write a novel, or you write a novel because you read a novel that seemed to transport you and you'd like to do that for a reader. Subsequent to that, after you've had experience, then you do it for different reasons. I think it's true about work in general, that you don't end up doing into your later life tasks for the same reasons precisely that you did those tasks when you were young. And I know I never did it because of money, because wasn't anybody paying me any money when I was starting it young. I was just doing it as a kind of a lark, and because I had failed at so many things in my life, that this was actually one thing that I hadn't failed at yet. So, I think in this little tendril of conversation is quite opposite to the reason that everybody does the work that they do. Sometimes when you're young, you do it for one reason. In the middle of your life, you do it for others. Late in your life, you do it for still others.
Right. Can I ask you what maybe some of those other jobs or other kinds of work that you explored were, where you think you failed?
Oh, yeah, sure. I was in the Marine Corps. I failed at that. I was in law school. I pretty much failed at that. I couldn't get a job as a sports writer on the Arkansas Gazette, of all things. Failed at that. I had a lot of false starts when I was quite late in my late teens and early 20s. I just thought, I didn't think, I'm being saved from these things for something better. It never occurred to me. I thought, is there anything that I can actually set my mind to doing that only I am responsible for giving me this job?
Wow.
And in which only I can decide if I fail or succeed, and that I haven't failed at yet.
Wow.
And I don't hold that out as a model for why people do the things that they do. It just happens to be what happened to me.
Well, I think I could speak to you forever, Richard Ford. I'm gonna.
Oh, I don't know.
Thank you again so much for making time for Drucker on the Dial. We really appreciate having you here, and congratulations on the anthology. And
you do, and I appreciate it a lot.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Absolutely.
Well, nice to talk to you.
Nice talking with you as well.
Drucker on the Dial is brought to you by the Drucker Management Path. The Drucker Management Path is the only management training program based on Peter Drucker's timeless teachings. It includes 3 workshops: managing oneself, managing my team, and managing for opportunity. For more about the Drucker Management Path, please visit druckerpath.com. Thank you for tuning in to Drucker on the Dial. As always, you can follow our ongoing conversation about leadership and management at our daily blog, The Drucker Exchange, at thedx.org, thedx.org.